There's a lot of things in game design that end up being invisible to the vast majority of people, which is normal. You're trying to play a video game and you're not going to pay attention to every single sort of detail that appears on screen. But a lot of those details end up having one main objective: to immerse you in this brand new world that you just got into. Final Fantasy, especially the older ones, are very, very good at doing exactly this. And one of the tools that they actually used is language. Final Fantasy X is the only Final Fantasy that uses not one, but 3 different scripts throughout the entirety of the game. You have the Spirit script, which is basically the language and the writing system that is mostly used by the entirety of the people in Spira. You have the Albed script that is used by the Albed. And finally, you have the Yevon script that is used mainly by the Yevon institutions, which is the main religion in Spira. By the way, a lot of the images that you're going to see are actually from this little book, Final Fantasy Ultimania Archive, and yeah, I took a lot of scans exactly from this book. The Spirit script is the one that is the most common that you can find in the world. The one thing that I notice is how everything is very organic and very spherical based, and it almost feels like waves, you know, because you have like a repetition of this element, for example, over here, right? It makes sense why water is such an important element in the world of Spira, because Spira is basically an archipelago of different little islands. And water is quite literally everywhere, and that translates to their overall culture. So much to the point that Blitzball became one of the most important, if not the most important, sports in the land. Here's an example where you can find this topography, the Blitzball team emblems. The cool thing about these emblems is how the topography is used. They actually kind of switch it up. For example, the Zanarkand Abe's logo, you can see the topography being used here to say Zanarkand, but then when they write Abe's, they go for like a more graffiti sort of style, which is pretty cool to see. They basically grab the script and then they do like little variations. Calico Beast is a pretty good one. Like the topography here is the Spirit script, but it's much taller, much more elegant even. The Albed Sykes is also a pretty good one because they join actually the Albed script with the Spirit script. And here, the Spirit script feels kind of like mechanized. It almost feels like chips or microchips, you know what I mean? Which definitely gives that vibe of the L Sykes being very technological and being in love with Machina and shit like that. This, very Jamaican, let's go. But you can find this font everywhere in Spira. Luca is probably the place that you find this topography a lot more, because, you know, it's the main city. You will have signs everywhere giving information about the place and what it's supposed to do and everything. This one is a big one where you have like saying weapons, items, even in places like this. The thing about this is that the architecture, this is a great example actually, because the architecture in this game is so different from anything else really, that can you imagine these like having like English phrases and words? Man, there would be something weird about it. It just wouldn't feel right. And I think that's probably why this game pushed so much this sort of topography work, because it wouldn't feel right to have like kanji or English words in such a different sort of vibe of architecture, you know what I mean? The Albed script, dude, I fucking love the script, by the way. It's kind of the same as the Spirit script in the sense that letter A corresponds to one of these symbols. It really showcases to you like what the Albed are all about. The 2 main characteristics of this is, 1, the font is always like fragmented. This piece is separated from this piece right here, separated from this piece, it's fragmented. And on top of that, all of these have like very, very jagged edges. It almost feels like incredibly dangerous. And that's kind of what the Albed are. The Albed are a sort of separatist group from Spira. The people of Spira do not like the Albed because they're all about Machina. Machina is basically modern technology. And so they kind of became this sort of rebel group within Spira. But at the same time, the struggles within the Albed are very much noticeable. There is a whole arc between the struggles of Riku, her brother, and her dad, all of them just fighting each other. I do want to mention that I've done a little bit of work in topography because I really like topography, and I'm not sure if they did this one or this one first. I would say that they probably did this one first. because this feels a little bit stretched. It feels like they went to Photoshop and they just stretched this typography and they just called it a day. Probably because of time constraints, I'm not gonna lie. But it doesn't feel like they did that, for example, with the sprint script. They definitely took a little bit more time with the sprint script. It makes sense because this script is used a lot more throughout the world. And the owl bed is way more sporadic. You will find it in places where the owl bed are, and you can find it all around the airship. This actually says over here, it says cockpit, for example. Or you can even see it here, all in these screens, right? It's all over the place. If you go and check the airship, it's all over the place. Even here on the bottom, it says something. I'm not entirely sure what it says. But the last one, and honestly probably the most important one, is the Yevon script. The Yevon script, and this is one of the scan images that I took, and so it is confirmed that this is based on Sanskrit. If you don't know what Sanskrit is, and I'm going to try to keep it simple and let me read it to you, is a classical language of Indian and liturgical language of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. It is also one of the 22 official languages of India. The name Sanskrit means refined, consecrated, and sanctified. It has always been regarded as the high language and used mainly for religious and scientific discourse. This is a very old goddamn language. At least from the small research that I did, this language is over 3,000 years old in its sort of archaic form and is still spoken. Obviously, it's not the same language, but Sanskrit is still spoken in certain places in India. I don't want to get too much into this because, man, if we wanted to talk about Buddhism and Hinduism, we would not leave this goddamn place, dude. There's too much information about it, okay? But at least from the small research that I did, the Saddam alphabet seems to me the one that is closest, like visually speaking in some of its characteristics, to the Yevon language. The Saddam alphabet came around, I believe, in the 5th or 6th century AD, and it does seem like it has a good chunk of similarities in the type of brushstroke that it has, and even in some of these elements, for example, the repetition of like these balls that you can see all over the place, and even some of these like little swirls that they normally do like over here, you know what I mean? But I would argue that at the end of the day, sure, it's based on Sanskrit, but they kind of really went their own way with this. But one thing that I will say is that the Yevon script definitely wants to do the sort of vibe that the Sanskrit has in both Buddhism and Hinduism, which is to bring this very ancient and very spiritual vibe to these institutions. Obviously, the places that you will find this typography are in the temples themselves, where you go and get the aeons. For example, over here, you can see that the whole typography is right over there. If you go to the Yojimbo Crypt, you can find all of this typography everywhere. In every dungeon that you go, you can absolutely find this font. Some characters have their own individual meanings, such as fire or Yevon. So for example, this one means Yevon and this one means sin. It's interesting how the Yevon letter or character is the first letter to appear and sin is the last one to appear. Yevon is kind of representation also of rebirth, of life, while sin is of death. And in my view, this was definitely on purpose because they kind of want to give you this idea of like the cycle of rebirth that is also very prominent in Buddhism. The cycle of life and death, you know what I mean? I do want to mention that mandalas are huge in this game. They're very, very important, which is also something that you can find where? Buddhism and Hinduism. A mandala is a spiritual and ritual symbol in Asian cultures. It can be understood in two different ways. Externally, as a visual representation of the universe, or internally as a guide for several practices that take place in many Asian traditions, including meditation. In Hinduism and Buddhism, the belief is that by entering the mandala and proceeding towards its center, you are guided through the cosmic process of transforming the universe from one of suffering into one of joy and happiness. This is really interesting because that's kind of what your main objective is throughout the game. Your main objective is basically to defeat sin. Sin is the one that brings death, and what is your objective is to basically go into sin and find the core of the problem, I guess, defeat him and bring the calm. And even And even the temples are kind of representative of that, in my view. You are entering a temple and going into the middle of the temple where you are finding this Aeon to help you on your main goal. These mandalas only show up whenever Yuna actually summons them, kind of like a ritual. And you can also find these mandalas in all of the temples that you go to. The Valley temple is probably the one that has a mandala that is most similar to the ones that you can find from Buddhism and Hinduism. Eifert is also kind of similar because there are a good chunk of mandalas that have this very big symbol in the middle, like you can find, for example, in this one right here. Ixion and Shiva are probably the one that feel very, very different. But it's awesome that they basically grab this concept and they just play around with it and try to figure out different visual styles in all of these temples. Man, there's so much to talk about games like Final Fantasy, to be honest, because there's so much little components about these games, especially the old ones, that feel so goddamn different from everything that I've seen on a visual standpoint, that adds so much to the world. And topography is easily one of those elements that is completely overlooked, which is normal, to be fair. But yeah, that's all I got, folks. I hope you have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Over and out.